This is exciting, everybody. We are here streaming live for the Big Y panel, Contemporary Folktale Retellings Meet Humanities. And here we are ready to ask questions in real time, but we need to know our panelists better. So we have Janice Del Negro, PhD, and Megan Wells, MFA. If you're curious who I am Rachel Hedman, the founding executive director of Story Crossroads, and definitely an honor to be here. Plus, we have our American Sign Language interpreters who are Angie and Drake, so we're thankful for that. And we're thankful, of course, to the funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities and Utah Humanities. So without them, this would not be free and available to you. And if you are watching this maybe down the road and not when it's the live stream, then at least you'll be able to enjoy the whole experience then. So we like to just jump into things really fast. We like to just get into why Janice and Megan love folk tales. And that, I think, connects to why to love contemporary folk tales as well. So first, we're going to have a little bit of that background from Janice, and then a little bit background from Megan. And then each of them will have a good about 25 minutes each to present, possibly telling a story, as well as some academics behind things. And then we get to the questions. So go ahead, Janice.
The way you say questions really worries me. There's a Nigerian poet. His name is Chinwezu Ibekwe. And he says, what kind of people we become depends crucially on the stories that we are nurtured on. And this is a really simple quote, but it has stayed with me for quite some time. When I think about where I first became fascinated with the folk and fairy tale, I have to go way back to my childhood. Maybe 8, maybe 9, in the Throgsneck branch of the New York Public Library in the Bronx. After I had been reading my way through the fiction section, I completely avoided the nonfiction. I was 8. I read nonfiction now. One of the librarians there came over to me one day and said, come on over here, I want to show you something. And she took me into the nonfiction section, and she stood me in front of 3 ranges of 398.2s, which are folk and fairy tales. And she said, here, read these. So I'd read them, and I kept reading them. And they became the frame through which I viewed the world as a child. And as I grew older and I started studying, folk and fairy tales in academia in a variety of disciplines, lots of reading, lots of research, it became the way that I guide my storytelling and my art, as well as my scholarship, which is an odd combination. I think I'm very lucky to be in a place that actually lets me do that. So that's, and I warn my storytelling students every semester that folktales and storytelling, they will take over your life. And after this course, you'll see stories everywhere you go. So that's where I came from. Megan?
I love that librarian.
I don't know her name.
Oh my gosh.
I tried to find out her name and I could never, because she terrified me as a child.
Yes. Well, she stands in the living archetype of the good librarian, right? So she is nameless. She is a folktale herself, the librarian.
Really? Capital T, capital L.
I'm really moved by your quote. Because as I've been thinking about how to describe all this in this Big Y panel, where you just said, now, what was his name, the first quote?
It's Chinwezu Ibekwe. Okay. He's a Nigerian poet.
Right. So the stories that you grow up with influence you. And I realized that I grew up in silence.
Oh,
I grew up without stories. And so my head's kind of spinning about that. So it was this sort of is this slow vacuum in me, right? And of course I was in stories, but they were the stories of a life, the rituals, the gossips, the rules. There were stories, but they weren't folk tales. And we'll get into that in the questions. That power of that folktale that sort of gives attention, that says, pay attention to this in a different way. So my first entrance into that vacuum was Disney.
that's okay, Megan.
It really was, right? And those books, Jill and Joe. You remember those books? Oh, forget about it. The early books, Joe's chasing Jill and Jill's chasing Joe, and those early readers. I did love to read about it. Well, then finally, I think I was in my early 30s when I went to Lake County College for a storytelling weekend because of Garrison Keillor, which was not folktale, but it was story. And I sat in a desk chair because it was held at a college and listened to Gioia Campanelli.
Oh, well, that would do it.
Tell that trope of the young girl who takes care of the old mother in the water. It was a river mother in this case, and combs her hair and grooms her in the water. And Janice, everyone, I was suddenly dreaming awake. And something I'd been trying to express about my own life had image and place and voice and permission. And that's what began it for me. I fell madly in love with it as a necessary food.
It's very hard for me to think of you without them because you're so totally in them. And it's very hard for me to think of you not having them. I'm so glad you found them.
Well, let's go with that vacuum theory, right? That silence.
You want to just suck it in.
Yeah.
But I think that however we came to it, we both wound up in the same place, which is a place where we have a deep and abiding love for the traditional story and the retelling of those stories and the reimagining of those stories in the present. Because certainly when we look at folk and fairy tales historically, we have difficulties with them in terms of gender representation and social norms. And so that's an issue that we address in the retelling. I think part of it depends if we talk about, what a folktale is. Some folktales are fairy tales, but not all fairy tales are folktales. And that's because when we talk about folktales, we're talking about something very, very generally that has been passed down, the passing of narrative orally from generation to generation, right? And the oral tradition is what we're talking about when we talk about traditional narrative. And traditional narrative can apply to a lot of things: folktales, fairy tales, fables, myths, legends. I know Megan does a lot of myth work. And there are some similar characteristics across culturally. We do have to differentiate between the European tradition of the folk and fairy tale and the traditions of the rest of the world, because the focus in Western academia has often been on Europe and the European tale, folk or fairy, and not the same structure or the same underpinnings don't work necessarily from cultural group to cultural group. I know there's some very popular writers on folklore that sort of ignore the things that don't fit into their theory. So you have to remember that we're looking at something that is wildly disparate from cultural group to cultural group. And so when we talk, we're talking in gross generalizations. I think part of what helps when you're looking at a traditional tale, for our purposes, we're going to talk about traditional folk tales and fairy tales. It depends on whether you're thinking of the folktale as a carrier of culture, right? As a culture carrier. If you're thinking of them as an artifact that's sort of frozen in time, or if you're thinking about them as an aesthetic object, we have many different ways of approaching them, depending on what discipline you're approaching them from. And so that becomes something to keep in mind. Trying to hold those things together in your mind can sometimes be a little difficult. But one thing to really keep remembering is that what they all are is that they're all stories. And stories have an enormous effect on people and on human beings. They are they're used for everything from selling you something in the marketplace to teaching lessons to young children, to entertaining with popular retellings in those tales. I laughed when Megan said her introduction to folk and fairy tales was really Disney, her and everybody else. I mean, Megan and everybody else. I mean, when you talk about fairy tales to children, for example, they will tell you they know the story of Cinderella because they know the Disney. They know the story of Beauty and the Beast because they know the Disney, and they know the animated Disney and the live action Disney. So they'll tell you all about it. And what comes as sort of a delight to children. I work with a lot of children and young adults, and they are very enamored of the idea that there are different versions of stories floating around out there. They're very enamored of it. And that sort of retelling those different, I don't mean variants from cultural group to cultural group. I mean retellings of stories that reimagine and reinterpret them for contemporary listeners, or in the case of cinema, for viewers. And so that becomes, excuse me. And so that's something that I found particularly young adults were fascinated by. They felt the ability to take a traditional story a story that they thought that they knew, and then retell that story in a way that made more sense to them and that framed the world for them differently was something that they were really fascinated by. It's not unusual to think about when you think about adolescents trying to get control of the world that they live in. It's not such a surprise. I have an example for you. I was at a high school working with creative writing classes, and we talked about traditional story and traditional fairy tales and the stories that they knew. And then I told them other versions of those stories. And I said, your job is to go and pick one of these stories. I broke them up into groups. I said, pick a story that you all know, and then talk about how you'd retell it. And in the middle of everybody, I had all kinds of technology. Okay, I had a smart board. I had all kinds of digital tech, and I gave them big giant pads and markers, and 3 teenagers around a big giant pad with markers, having an absolute blast, retelling a fairy tale, making drawings on the edges, doing all sorts of. And in the middle of this activity, a girl came up to me. She was about 16, I guess. And she said, okay, so in the earlier versions of Sleeping Beauty, she's pregnant when she wakes up. And I said, well, yes, she is. And you said, okay, so there was no consent there. And I said, well, no. And she said, well, I'm going to retell the hell out of this story. And she went back and she started working on the story in a completely different way. There is something about the folk and fairy tale that captures the popular imagination in ways I haven't seen anything else quite like it, really. And I've spent a lot of time with contemporary retellings of folk and fairy tales. There are dozens of collections of short stories. There's this surge in folk and fairy tale fantasy that has been really growing over the last 2 decades. That has been hugely influential, I think. We have Disney going back into the vault and deciding they're going to live action all the animated fairy tales, which works better for some things than for other things. And there are other big screen adaptations of folk and fairy tales that have been extraordinarily popular. I remember I teach a class on folk and fairy tales and contemporary media. And I remember looking for movies. And I was sort of staying within the US and the English language environment, and in movies that had been written and created in the United States. And then I sort of ventured afield of that. And there were a lot. I mean, there were a couple of dozen. I mean, I can make you a list. But when I went outside the English-speaking world and started looking at Eastern Europe and the Ukraine and Poland and Iceland even, there are hundreds of them. I mean, the connection to the traditional story is so strong. It was astonishing to us. I can't even get through them all. There's so many of them. And so that became, that was really interesting to me. There is a great one. Of course, now I'm not going to remember the name of it. There was a great story, a great film it was Icelandic, I think. And it was a typical Journey Quest folktale, but it was so simply and elegantly done. There was a moment in the story where the hero walks into this arbor that has a dining room with all of this food, this beautiful food, goblets of wine and baskets of fruit. And my daughters who were in the room with me, one of them on one side said, "Don't eat that." And the other one on the other side said, "Don't drink that either." I felt that I had succeeded as a parent at that moment. And it was just wonderful to see how differently things are interpreted for the screen. And when we're talking about contemporary retellings now, there's poetry, right? There's poetry, there's short stories, there's I'm looking for my list of things to tell you that there's something really wonderful about the fact that we are in a world currently where the tangible and the intangible are increasingly at odds, right? Tangibles and intangibles are increasingly at odds, and information is both ephemeral and powerful. Story has a really crucial place there, because story becomes the way that we impose structure on the world that we live in. And so it helps us not lose our minds when we're terrifically overstimulated with information. There is, when we talk about storytelling and storytelling with folktales, we're talking about the creation of story in the moment, right? The storyteller and the listeners who create the story together, and synthesizing this multitude of variables that results in a distinct one-time only occurrence. It won't ever occur this way again. The story will never be told this way again. And so when we're looking at, depending on how you're looking at the folktale, now if you're looking at it as an artifact, it stays frozen on the page. It stays where we found it. We don't change it. We don't adjust it. We don't play with it. It becomes an artifact, and it lives under glass. If we think of it as a culture carrier, we have a lot of research to do to make sure that we understand all of the elements in the tale, particularly if the story doesn't come from a culture with which you are highly familiar. So there's that. But if we think of it as an aesthetic object, then it becomes how do you tell the story? How do you structure the story within the rules of literature and creative writing, right? So we're looking at something that becomes an aesthetic object, and how do we evaluate it in that way? But if we look at it as it's a story, and it's a story that I'm going to tell you, the parameters suddenly become much wider, and the walls around it a lot thinner. We have contemporary media, novels and short stories based on fairy tales. We have collections of fairy tales from all around the world now. Initially in the United States, publishing of fairy tales was mostly concerned with the tales of the West. And it was only later in the century that we were looking at in terms of popular publishing, a much wider net. The net was cast much wider. Excuse me. When we're looking at cinema, some of you must have seen Snow White and the Huntsman. This was a huge, very expensive film that was popular enough that they made a sequel to it without Snow White in it. We have, as Megan mentioned, all of the Disney. I have to tell you, I like Disney. There are a lot of people who look at folk and fairy tales and look at Disney and have real problems with it. But I think we're looking at something that turned into a popular phenomenon, and I'm not sure that you can argue with that, with the appeal of that so much. So we have, and we have to thank Disney, because the exposure to Disney that we've had has really, it meant that those tales, when we went to retell them, those tales were already familiar, right? The tales were already familiar to the listeners or the viewers. And so we automatically had sort of a hook there as to how do we pull them into, how to pull them into the story. The difficulties, of course, is that they're not the only stories that exist. So we need to keep that in mind as well. There's fairy tales and poetry, from Anne Sexton to Christine Hepperman, who is much more current. There's collections of short stories and fairy tales. Kate Bernheimer, who is a fairy tale scholar, has put together several large collections of tales where she asks writers to retell the stories that we know in ways that we don't know. And so we have tales, we have movies, we have collections, we have deliberate retellings of tales. We have Snow White and Sleeping Beauty and Into the Woods and graphic novels and erotica that are built around folk and fairy tales. And so that becomes, the range is tremendous, the available range. I'm watching my time here. I'm sure we'll get more into specifics when we have some questions, but right at this moment, I would like to tell you a very short story so that we stay on. Now, I'm going to keep it short because we'll stay on our time if we do it that way. This was one of the earliest things that I retold to this extent, and I can talk to you a little bit about it afterwards. When he came in through the window, all she could see was shadow, surrounded by a halo of light. It seemed as if the prince himself gave off the heat she felt rise to her cheeks. His words slipped over her skin like warm honey. There was no question she would let him in. If her mother had discovered her subsequent condition, would she have turned her out? Could a woman who had waited so long for a child, for grandchildren. Exile her only daughter to a desolate waste. Sometimes the way the story goes depends on who gets to tell it.
Mhm.
The only way out of the tower was for Rapunzel to cut her hair. Contrary to what you might have heard, it was no great loss. She cut that golden rope just below her shoulder, tied it to the iron ring at the window, and lowered herself to the ground. On her back, she carried everything she owned: needle and wheel, cup and knife, bowl. In her head, she carried everything her mother had taught her: the ways of plants, the paths of birds, the riches of the woods, and how to reap them. Who decided that the time was right for leaving? It was early spring when Rapunzel left the tower. It was nearly winter 2 years later when the prince finally found her. He had been searching for many months, sure he would never find her. Sure her mother had cursed her. Sure he would be desolate of heart always. She was not lost. She was not hidden. But he looked only for the signs of a broken woman, a faded footprint, a snapped twig, a scrap of cloth. He looked only at the ground. He never thought to look up, where in the distance he would have seen smoke where there should be no smoke, evidence of warmth where there should be no warmth. It was by their children's laughter that he found her. They spent that winter in front of the hearth in the woods, his head in her lap, her tears in his eyes, their children at their feet. The following spring, they journeyed to the prince's kingdom where they were met with great rejoicing. But the next winter, and every winter after that, they returned to the hearth in the woods where her mother came to visit them. Sometimes the way the story goes depends on who gets to tell it. So, thank you, sweetie.
I love that.
I was asked to retell Rapunzel for a conference. And we were going to have 4 or 5 tellers retell the same story for this conference. And I was asked to, and the story they chose was Rapunzel. And there was a traditional version, there was a steampunk version, there was a fantasy version set in an entirely different fantasy universe, and there was mine. And I looked at the story and thought, well, where am I going to start this? Where am I going to go with this? And I cut off the entire front end of the story and concentrated on what happened in the tower. And so that became the focus of the tale. It also set me off on a journey to create 5 to 7 minute stories out of these huge, complicated fairy tales. So I have a few of those now. But when you look at a story and you want to retell it for contemporary listeners, you have to look at the things that are in the story that need to be adjusted or changed. And how to be reviewed. How do you change them? And it has to be very carefully done in order not to feel overworked.
Mm-hmm.
Has anyone seen the latest Cinderella on Amazon Prime? I don't think you should watch it, really. But it is a very good example of trying too hard.
Yes.
It's yours, Megan.
I I love that. I hope everyone listening took note. The way Janice will take the trope, the bone, the unchangeable thing, and then it's turned in such a fresh way. That's, I think, the center of what I'm going to talk about here. I'm going to talk a little bit about process. So let's go to that moment of his head in her lap, her tears in his eyes. Everyone knows that's Rapunzel. We also know that it's so you get the moment that's Rapunzel, but you also get the whole lineage of all the tears and eyes to the Firebird, all the way back to Psyche and Eros. It's that beautiful resonant chord. So I love that. You have lots of those in that story. So the question is, what is the bones? What is the unchangeable? Right. And there's no fundamental truth on this. There's nothing fundamental, but there is a balance of the whole that you're trying to achieve. When I work with third graders, I take them Hansel and Gretel, and we get to the point where she pushes the witch in the oven and I utterly skip it. And then she and the witch, they have a nice conversation and they sit down. No. Wait, what? She has to push her in the oven. She has to what? She has to push her in the oven. Why does she have to push her in the oven? Because that's the way the story goes. And so there's a sensitivity as a teller to that's the way the story goes. And there's an obligation in the teller to question those moments of that's the way the story goes. That's the way the story goes is both good and also our blind spots. So you as a storyteller are challenged to look at those moments and have enough of those bones, the recognizable bones, even as you're digging up in new and fresh ways. I'd love to start with a telling and then talk about process with that. So I've been challenged by Little Red Riding Hood for some time. Some of my own personal history is very sensitive to a girl getting lost in the woods, being confronted by a wolf. So stories, folk tales, when you hear them, contain traumas and clues of how to survive those traumas. I was talking to someone just yesterday who was talking about, why are the Grimms so dark? It's like, well, because the culture was going through that. Those people were experiencing great dark, and the stories were a way to manage that dark, pass it down to the children with clues and cautions. Don't go into the woods at night and be careful of the wolf. So, and also I'm sensitive, the wolf itself is a living creature, but the wolf itself is an archetype. And so how much of our behavior toward our wolves is based on our archetypes of the wolf, things, the wolf being the villain, and gives us a certain freedom to villainize wolves, the living being. And so I started to look deeper at the wolf and the archetypes of the wolf and the lineage of the wolf. So I won't talk any more about that. I'll tell a story and then we'll pick it apart. Shh. Red, quiet your heart, quiet your heart. She didn't say it out loud. She didn't dare say it out loud. She was saying it inside her head to herself to quiet her heart. She was in a tight spot. This was a pickle, indeed. Above her, just above her, on the floorboards, she could hear the wide, sure pads of his paws. He was on all fours now. He was walking the whole of grandmother's cottage with his nose bent low. Little Red, I know that you are still here. I can smell you. The wolf. And then she could see through that little moonlight that came through the crack of the trap door to the pickle cellar. She was in the pickle cellar. She could see his black velvet nose and his sniffing seemed to pull her hair like a beckoning wind. Shh, shh, where is grandmother? What has happened to grandmother? What am I going to do? Whatever am I going to do? She didn't dare move. It was very tight there in the pickle cellar. The pickles were now all eaten. It was the end of the season, which is why she had come from mother's with the basket of her pickle jars full of all the brine. That was mother's job to make the brine, and she taught Red all the recipe. And she would bring that to grandmother, and together they would harvest the cucumbers and cut them and place them in and put them here in this pickle cellar. It was a good thing she was not too old to still fit in it. She remembered many a game of hide and seek as a little one. Why had she stopped for flowers? If she hadn't stopped for the flowers, she would have been here long before dark. And why, when she saw the door open, did she go in? And why, when she went in and she saw that it was so dark in there, didn't she go over to the curtains and open the curtains wide so at least some of the moonlight could come in, or grab a lantern up? No, all she heard was, Red, Red, come to the bed, and such a voice. It worried her so. Grandmother, you sound so sick. And so Red had run straight toward the bed. She hadn't even bothered to put her basket down or take down her red cloak. She had just simply opened up the canopy curtains, and by the little candlelight there and Grandma's candle lantern, she saw grandmother. Oh, Red, come closer. I am so ill on this day. Oh, grandmother, yes, I see that you are ill. And in your illness, it seems as if your hair is all matted up. Your hair is all matted up, so it looks like you have very large ears. Well, let us hope that it will make it easier to hear you when you come closer. She knew it was the wolf from the moment she saw the beast in grandmother's bed. She only asked the questions to delay the time. Oh, grandmother, your eyes too in your sickness have grown quite large. Yes, come closer so that I can see you. And with these sick eyes, perhaps I can see you differently or better. Come closer. Grandmother, her hand was in the basket as she bought time. On one of the pickle jars. And she was twisting and winding that pickle jar. There was one that was loose enough, getting that top off the pickle jar. She had the top off, and then she had her hand on that pickle jar. Grandmother, your teeth too. What big teeth you have. The better to eat you with, my dear. Yes, that is what he said, as he leapt from underneath the covers to reveal himself. And she was ready with that jar of vinegared brine. And Red tossed that vinegared brine right into those large eyes. And he, from the burn of it and the sputtering and the taste and the fume of it, well, he was off the bed and he was rolling and pawing, which gave her the time she needed to throw that jar across the room to convince the wolf that she was over there. And thankfully, it did hit all the plates, and it was such a loud crashing and tumbling to the floor that he did not hear her. She lifted the door to the trap to go down into the pickle cellar here. He slept. I must stay awake. I must figure out. He's so heavy. I can't. She slept. And then, just as the light of dawn rose unseen behind the pulled tight curtains, the door burst open. Red, Red, are you here? Grandmother, Red, where are you? Oh, she saw that wolf laying there on that pickle cellar, and grandmother reached for that broom, and by that broom she took its handle and she opened up those curtains so that the morning light hit that much changed wolf. And the magic, the spell of night and full moon was past, and words were gone, and he rose up, nothing but a hungry, bad wolf. Get you gone, get, I'm not afraid of you, get out, go. And by that broom, grandmother swept that went, don't you cross my threshold ever again, do you hear me? Red, grandmother. And Red was rescued from the pickle cellar and into the arms of grandmother. What took you so long? I went to get you flowers. Don't. I feared, I knew the marauder was about. I went all the way to the mother's. Can you imagine our fright when we did not find you? And then I rushed back here, making it only in time for dawn. Don't pick flowers so late and at night in the woods, Red. I promise I'll never do it again. Good. Now, let us make some pickles. But I don't think we want them sour this season, do we, Red? I think this season we want them sweet. Get the sugar from the cupboard, will you? Yes, grandmother. Red fetched the sugar. And oh, the pickles that year. Oh, they were sweet indeed. Thank you. And so that is an example of a retelling of a story we know very, very well. And how do you get there? One of the things I want to talk about, and I know we'll have questions and answers time, but I really want to talk about who's in the room when you tell, and its influence on you as you work on your retelling. Part of the study of any folktale is to understand the audience that it was told to, its context. And by audience, I mean those who listen, who give audience, who attend to the hearing of the story. And so by that work of context and culture, your research, which Janice was guiding us into, as a teller, you discover then in all those variants that those early stories were told to listeners who feared the wolf would come and eat their livestock, who had to keep their fires burning to keep the wolves away, who would live near packs of wolves. So their relationship to the wolves were a very different relationship than we have now. And so that influences the telling of the story to the listeners of the story, right? We're all in a language together. Plus, this story is being told to teach the daughters not to go into those woods. You have to give them a strong image of something really fearful that will keep them from going into those woods. Woods are not forest preserves. The woods we know now are not those raw, ancient woods that our ancestors were living in. So that's the fabulous, delicious journey of who was listening to the tale and what were they hearing? And now what does my modern audience hear? So when I say big bad wolf, what comes to mind? What? Big business trying to protect their livestock from the wolves eating and decreasing their profit. We hear it from a completely different place. So as a teller, then I have to do my work around the wolf. And then the question comes up, why does the wolf talk? How can he talk? How do I do that in a world that's grown up on Harry Potter and Lupin? So they understand werewolves. So suddenly I go all the way back to the Celts, to the mythology of the Celts and those very, very early werewolves who were cursed into their werewolf form because our understanding of our gods were changing. We were going from an understanding of a multiplicity of God. God is earth and multiplicity. The God is singular and based in the universe and the stars above rather than below. And so there's this curse that's placed on those who would run with the wolves, right? So then that's exciting to me because now I can bring a werewolf to you that's somehow clean of the judgments and the villainy and is just a being, a fearsome being that Red must face. And it brings alive Red's agency. It becomes a unique moment in a girl's life. And then what we were talking about in Genesis is what are the unique things that the story isn't if you drop them, right? What big eyes you have, what big ears you have, what big. So how do you work with, is Red innocent? Does she really believe that her grandmother looks like that? Not to a modern audience. A modern audience will never buy that. The kids are much more savvy. It's you tell it like that, they shout out at you, it's the wolf, it's the wolf, it's the wolf. Now that's not a bad thing, as long as you know that that's what's going to happen and you're working with that. That can be really fun. But I was looking for that way to keep those moments, and it also gave Red that girls are not as innocent as we think. She's grown up with a lot of wisdom, and she has the ability to take care of herself there in the moment. And so she finds what is at hand. And so to me, that sort of shifts the story out of its violence too. We don't need a woodcutter to come in. We don't need the masculine archetype to come in and save the helpless, young, innocent, feminine archetype. In this case, a long tradition between a grandmother and a mother and a daughter, a passed down tradition, gives her the tools that she needs to handle herself in that moment. And you'll notice that the wolf lives and grandmother lives and Red lives wiser. So we have a journey from innocence to wisdom. So I just want to double check my time. I think some of the things that I love very much about folk tales is that, and I can only speak to our own culture here because that's the one I'm in. It seems that our culture has deemed the journey of a life to be from innocence to knowledge. It's what you know that makes your measure. But what the folk tales do is they give you a journey from innocence to wisdom. And knowledge is gathered as tools along the way. And that makes knowledge less of a thing and a measure and a tool for power. It actually makes knowledge more of a place. So you sort of stand on that ledge with what you know, looking over, ready to leap. And I think that it sort of cools down some of the fundamentalism of right and wrong, and which is why I'm so devoted to it as a part of any humanities education, is to empower the student, empower the listener through folk tales into an emotional intelligence in this journey from innocence to wisdom, with knowledge as a tool that you gather along the way. So I think I see Rachel's face popping in. That's probably a good moment here to pass it on to question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janice and Megan. So let's have our arms in the air. Now, if you're listening on YouTube stream, you can still do that yourself. But I think it's always wonderful, the backgrounds that we get from this, which prepares us for the questions and answers. Now, some questions we got ahead of time, and some you can now put it in the comments. So the very first question, though, to just jump us in there, will be, and we'll have Janice answer it first, and then we'll get Megan's thoughts on that. And it's as a result of today's current events, and today can mean many things. It could be the past year or so, what you determine as today. As a result of today's current events, how do you see folktale retellings evolving? Okay. So Janice, you're first.
I think that there's a, there's a media fascination. So I think we'll probably see more, more movies, more television that have tropes from traditional tales. I don't think you can get away with the misogyny that is inherent in a lot of folktales, traditional tales. I think there's usually a shift away from that. It's hard, if we're thinking about the tale as an aesthetic object, it's hard to consider how that might evolve, because it'll evolve differently with each teller, right? It'll be a different evolution. Somebody's going to write about being stuck in Rapunzel's tower for 2 years. Yes. Right. Somebody's going to write about that, about being trapped forever. Somebody's going to do a retelling of Sleeping Beauty where she doesn't wake up. She just sleeps for 100 years. I mean, there's, because of the isolation of the last couple of years, I have seen that sort of downplaying of violence in retellings. I think there's such a tremendous amount of violence in the world. I think that there is sometimes a reaction against that. I mean, look at Megan's Little Red Riding Hood. We have the wolf is being chased out of the house with a grandmother with a broom. The woodsman was a later edition anyway. So, but I think that is something that is really up to the individual reteller. I think the notion of telling stories from cultural groups that are not dominant groups, I think that's going to be addressed again in terms of execution and discussion. There is a delicate balance between telling a story from a culture that's historically oppressed and telling a story from a culture that was not. And I think we're going to be looking at that balance again. I mean, we've been talking about it for a long time. I think we're still going to be talking about it.
Yes, agreed.
Megan? See a trend anywhere?
Yeah, I think you've got that covered. I really do. I think we are attempting to evolve, right? Human beings evolve when they're in pain. And I do think the pandemic was kind of a bruise, pain being pushed on. And so there's much more awareness around how trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder really affects our behavior. And so, and we can, and I think that's going to affect how we tell our stories. So.
And we have plenty of questions, so let's delve into the next one. This time, let's start with Megan and then do Janice for this particular question. How does storytelling and the humanities help in creative thinking? How do contemporary folktale retellings help in those creative thinking goals?
Oh, I think that folk tales, fairy tales, traditional tales are definitely give you more keys on your piano. I really, really do. Right. So we have a certain emotional range, a certain intellectual range, and maybe their little harpsichord, we're not even to the organ with 2 layers yet. Right. So they expand your keys that you can play and how you understand the world. So if we're going to move toward being one people under one moon with a gazillion stories, we need those stories. Stories take us out of ourselves and more into the universal sense of belonging to a global community.
God, we love a good metaphor. That's more keys to your piano, indeed.
The piano. Is there anything more important than emotional intelligence for this next generation?
No.
There just really isn't. It's how we get through our prejudices and our programmed fears is emotional intelligence.
If creative thinking is looking at something from a different perspective or a different angle, the reimagining of folk and fairy tales is an excellent exercise for that. Yes. Trying to see things from different points of view, trying to see the point of view of an individual character. We can even see that in Disney's live action stuff, some of it, where with the villain movies, right? Trying to explain the backstory of the villain.
Yes.
So that we know how the villain got to where they are. And that explanation of backstory is sometimes fascinating and sometimes really out there. But either way, it is an effort, right? It's an attempt to bring some sort of contemporary understanding of the emotional things that are happening in the tale. I'm done.
That's what I thought. We have the next question. We're just going to go boom, boom, boom as much as we can.
Good. Go.
And so the next question is, what connections to archaeology and material culture can be found in contemporary folktale retellings? So this one, instead of both of you, do we have a preference of who'd like to answer this one?
I'll start. I think that if we're looking at, see, this is a multifaceted question. If we're looking at a folktale as an artifact, then it gets preserved in the earliest version we can find it, right? So if we're looking at the story as an artifact, the same way you'd look at an archaeological artifact, for example, we've got something that's taken out of time and frozen in place. If we're thinking about what actually to material culture, for retellings, it would be difficult because the retellings are contemporary, right? If we're talking about contemporary retellings, the mindset of the reteller is not concerned about the material culture of the past so much as it is with the material culture of the present. So that becomes another way of looking at the story, maybe a comparison between an earlier version of the tale and a contemporary retelling would give some interesting answers to those questions.
Mhm. I also want to add in here that stories themselves are often the breakthrough data for archaeologists as to understand what a particular object in a find is. So if you find something in a dig and it looks like a weapon, and then you are able to translate the stories on the wall, then you learn that it's not a weapon and that it's actually a sacred object. Your complete understanding of that culture moves from a weaponized people
Right.
to a mystical people. It changes everything. So folk tales and fairy tales, those old stories themselves contain the artifact, the interpretations of the culture.
And I think we're talking about culture a lot too, which I know you specifically wanted to touch on cultural appropriation. So it so happens we have a question on that. And so our next question is, how do you capture those fragments of culture without cultural appropriation?
Mhm. Go, Janice. And
If
then
you
I'll
want to
add.
go first.
Yeah.
All
We
right, if I
talk
get
about this a
Janice has
lot.
been volunteered.
It's really near and dear to our hearts.
Every story requires a certain amount of reflection. There are issues involved in telling stories from a culture that is not your own, particularly if those cultures have been traditionally, historically oppressed. At minimum, you should know the source of the story you're telling. That is like the most minimal parameter here. You need to know the source of the story. If possible, you need to know the function of the story and the culture from which it came, which is harder to find. I think the whole story about this issue includes, we have to be very upfront about the fact that there are many cultural groups, indigenous and otherwise, who consider stories cultural property that rightfully belongs to their cultural group. And it's the importance of listening that applies here. We have to think about the points of view. Heeding the points of view of tellers from these cultures is crucial to like the big picture or the big part of the story. Telling stories with respect means respecting the stories, the tellers, and the cultures from which the stories come. It's very easy for members of the dominant culture to talk about the universality of the folktale and how folktales travel and it's all part of our universal humanity. And this is very easy to say if you're the person in charge. It's very easy to bypass the fact that we have tellers in the storytelling community today who are very clear about how they feel about people telling stories from their cultures without preparation or permission. And we've been talking about this for decades, and the story has not changed. We are still in the position where as members of a dominant culture, we feel free and easy to borrow and adapt from cultural groups that aren't ours, whereas cultural groups that aren't ours might not be so free and easy about that process. So I think it requires a lot of thought.
I do too. I think that I'd like to speak to the issue of trust. So when we're sitting in our individualities around our individual relationship to story and the audiences we want to tell to, our well-meaningness around that universal voice, that's one thing. But we are actually a community. And emergent strategy, Mari Brown speaks to this so brilliantly in her book, Emergent Strategy. It really is a strategy that is patient with each other around trust. And this is about each individual teller being patient around trust. that we are repairing damages that were done by ancestors of our past. They're on our shoulders. They don't just go away. Oh, I didn't do that. No, that was done. And it's our job to transform the pains of the past. So there's a trust required that says it may not be right to tell any of those stories at all while that particular culture of our storytellers re-owns them and works through that. And we respect it and trust with patience that a time will come, a time will come. So it's moving into a communal understanding. I think that can help us process through cultural appropriation.
I mean, there are stories that I don't tell anymore.
Me too.
There are stories that I used to tell as a young teller, which was a really long time ago, that I don't tell now. And I don't tell them, not because they're not good stories, because believe me, it broke my heart, but because they're not mine. I don't get to tell them. It's why the retellings in my case are important to my art, is that creation of an original story based on traditional motifs provides an enormous amount of freedom to the reteller. So,
yes,
That was important to
Yes.
delve into. So thank you.
yes.
We're going into more fun questions, of course. So the next one is, when we create modernized retellings of folk tales, are we then not only serving the listeners today, but making an important historical contribution for the cultural anthropologists of the future? And then, of course, you follow it up with why or why not. So who would like to jump into that one first? Should we
let me.
Oh, okay, go, Janice, go.
Yes, we are. And here's why. I think when we look at popular culture over time, we glean a tremendous amount of information from looking at elements of that culture, of popular culture. I think the change from the frequently misogynist material you find in traditional story to stories that do not contain that same level of misogyny, for example, the racism that you find in some traditional tales, all of those things are ameliorated by the contemporary gestalt. You know, what was allowed, what was permissible, and sometimes laudable in a particular era is not permissible or laudable in another. And so I think that looking at the way a story changes over time gives us a tremendous amount of information about what was happening in terms of the context surrounding the story.
Agreed. Just a brief personal answer to this. When my eldest child claimed themselves transgender, and invited me into the they them pronoun for them, we had a long discussion about the stories that they grew up with and the impact of those stories that I unconsciously as a mother, I wasn't unconscious as a mother, I was conscious then. The consciousness that I had at the time when I was telling them, I was giving them he, she.
Right.
He, she. Two genders allowed. He, she. Find the other like a puzzle and go on happily ever after. It wasn't my intention to be eliminating choices. This was so we went back through those stories, and I'm retelling those stories and looking for ways to come into an understanding of gender. There's not just two. The gender is a multiplicity and as unique as each individual. And what does the biology have to do with it anyway? So yes, the answer is yes. We are responsible to 7 generations ahead of us to leave them better maps if we can.
Well, at least now we know it's number 7. It's not 6 or 8, everybody. We'll type down in ink or Sharpie or stone, but thank you so much, of course. There are so many wonderful questions here. Let's get into this one. And Megan, I'm giving you a heads up now that you're going to be first, because Karen's been first a few times. We got to even this out, right?
Okay.
So the question is, how do contemporary folktale retellings link to the stories that we tell ourselves? And then share some examples. The follow-up is, how does this relate to performing contemporary folktale retellings?
So if I understand the question is, how does the story change us personally? And then how does that personal shift then translate
the stories
out?
that we tell ourselves.
Okay, so the stories I tell myself are the stories that I've been told. They are the stories that I am programmed, I was raised into. And quite specifically, something like Little Red is a story that I always told myself. Wolves will eat you. And by wolves, I mean, the negative masculine. The wolves will eat you. And so I grew up with this. Here's the opposite of misogyny, right? Here's what is that called? Misandrogyny or so I grew up with a fear of the masculine, which was taught to me by the stories. And so my personal stories, the stories I tell myself, be afraid of this or be afraid of that, are working in the background. And it isn't until here's the whole humanities piece, emotional intelligence. It isn't until I take the folk tale or the fairy tale and work it that I am actually working something inside me, and I change my understanding of the world. And then I can go forward as a storyteller with more consciousness, with a wider piano.
People keep saying that personal stories are the stories that reveal you to your listeners. I think every story is a personal story and reveals you to your listeners. So thinking about a story that I tell myself, here's a practical example. Oh, I'm going to be so sorry I said this. So if the story that I tell myself is that love conquers, right? That love conquers, that is the story. And I run across a story where love is cheap and is minimally defined. Here, for example, there was a Scandinavian tale, and it was about 3 brothers, and each brother had 3 wishes. How they got the wishes, we don't know. Each brother had a wish. There were 3 wishes, each brother has a wish. The first 2, the 2 older brothers wish for gold, and the youngest brother wishes that every woman he sees will love him. In the traditional versions of this tale, our youngest brother is a player, and the entire journey of the tale is him having sex with married women who are then beaten by their husbands. And then he gets to the palace and wins the princess, and everybody lives happily ever after. So I read the story and I'm like, well, hell, I'm not going to tell that story. And I put it aside. Mm-hmm. And then I come back to the story and I look at the story and go, okay, obviously there's something here that is bringing me back to the story. So what is it? I am very fond of the 3 brothers once had 3 wishes. How they got those wishes is not the subject of this tale. Suffice it to say they had them. So I have my 3 brothers, and I have my youngest brother. If I'm going to tell this story in which love conquers, then he cannot be a player, right? He cannot be a player. He has to be an innocent. And so on his journey, he meets 3 women, and each of those women provides him with something he had not had before outside of sex. Right? That's not the first one thinks of him as a mother. The second one thinks of him like a sister. So then he gets to the palace, and we have a character that deserves to win. Right? We have a character now that deserves to win the princess. He deserves to win now.
Mhm.
And he deserves to win because he is in some ways he is an innocent. And I'm very fond of this character. I really like him a lot. And I think that's something that calls to individual retellers. It's hard to answer this question specifically about creative work because everyone is going to come up with something different. What are the rules for doing this? Rules are break all of them. I mean, if you break them all, Carol Birch used to say, "Sin boldly." If you do it really well, nobody cares if you broke all the rules, right? If the story works, nobody cares if the rules got broken. And so that's something to keep in mind. I think that if storytelling is a living art, then what we do in contemporary retellings is connected to a history of a living art. And so when we tell stories now, we are connected to all of those tellers that came before in this process. I'm going to pick up the story and I'm going to tell it this way.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know if that answers the question at all.
I think it does.
I think it does.
It does. Yes.
In fact, we're ready for the next one. You ready?
Yes. Yes.
I feel like I'm on a game show.
For the answer.
For the answer. Now you're ready? This is worth like 1,000,000 points.
Okay.
How much of a limitation is it to have to work with such a limited number of folk tales the audience is familiar with?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question.
Who wants to be first?
I just limited. I don't so I would just have to work with that for a little bit because I don't personally feel it's limited. I'm still running into new folk tales and fairy tales.
And you're still telling them.
And still telling them and then
Right.
changing them. So but I understand the question theoretically, and every pianist comes to a piano. Why am I on piano standing and play the piano? Every pianist comes to the piano is probably frustrated. He doesn't have a whole nother range of keys, but he's only got 2 hands. So it's a lifetime of music that comes out of those 88 keys,
Right.
A lifetime. So I think the limitations in some ways drive us to expand and go deeper. And I think some of the familiarity is inherent to the art of storytelling. Some of what makes storytelling is that sense of familiarity that creates that sense of relaxation and conversation. We are in a culture that overemphasizes originality, and it is something we need to keep in mind. Is to hold that tension of the familiar and the original, and keep those dancing together. It grounds us.
I don't think we're limited to stories that the audience knows.
Yeah.
I mean, that Scandinavian tale, nobody knows that story. And I tell it a lot and get a lot of really good feedback on it. So I don't think we're limited. I think there is, if you're introducing people to retellings of traditional stories, it helps to start with something with which they are familiar, because then they feel like they're in on the joke. Right? They feel like they're on the inside of the story as opposed to the outside of the story. So I think that's something to consider when you're thinking about audience. Misty's follow-up question, does a retelling lose some of its resonance if they're not familiar with the original tale? Possibly. But it's hard to tell how people are going to react, right? Every person who hears the story hears a different story and reacts to it differently. I mean, I tell a variant of a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin, And I remember telling it in a concert once, and my goddaughter was there, and she was an adult. She didn't know the story of Rumpelstiltskin. And I was sitting there going, God, I have failed as a godmother, like forever. I have completely failed. But she heard the story and she was fine. She thought it was really interesting and fascinating, and she was going to go find the story and read it.
Yeah,
Right, find more traditional versions. So we have there's different ways. So it can lose some resonance. I'm looking at Misty's question.
yes,
It can, but not necessarily. But if the story's good,
yes, that's it.
if the story's good, it should work.
The story has to hold on its own, no matter whether people know it or not. The story has to hold it on its own. So those who know it, they have different resonances, and those who don't will be inspired and go find it.
Yeah.
It's part of our job.
And Joe actually added to it, because Joe had the original question. Then Misty, we're kind of going back and forth a little bit there. But Joe,
hello, Joe and Misty.
Joe has the comment of, I guess we're talking about two different kinds of retellings. The kind that riffs on tales the audience knows, like the two tales that Megan and Janice started with, and the kind that we find and choose. So maybe not a specific question, but any thoughts on that particular statement from Joe?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. And the thing is that when you go looking for something speaks to you, right? When you find a story that you want to tell, I mean, that the Three Brothers story, I read that and thought, well, I'm never going to tell that. And then I found myself going back to the story again. So there's something in the story that when we feel sort of this tug to tell it, that's very individual, yes. I think, and it becomes, and that's where the fun is, right? That's where the fun really is. I mean, Cooper Braun and Anne Harding, Rachel Ann Harding do the fairy tale variations, 5 tellers, 5 different versions of the same story. And that's one of which is the more traditional version, right? So if you don't know the traditional story, we're going to do that story first, and here's the rest, and here are the retellings. And the variety among the retellings is just tremendous. And the variety comes from the individual, the creative spark from each individual who's doing a retelling, right?
I want to take a minute, if I may, and just ask Drake. I don't want to put you on the spot, but that the language for if something speaks to you was so beautiful. Would you show our audience that ASL word for something speaks to you?
Nice. Beautiful.
Oh, beautiful.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thanks for being a great sport, Greg.
Thank you. Personal rules.
Yes. Oh, let me ask the question. I know Jazz is jumping in.
Welcome.
But the question here is, do you have any personal rules you follow when you do a modernized retelling of a folk tale? So who would like to go first on that particular one? Okay, so Megan, definitely you're first. That's a definite sign of first.
Okay.
And then we'll follow by Janice, but I'm looking at the time. We're starting to wrap up. So after this question, we might have time for maybe one more question plus the final question. So just to give you.
Okay, I'll go as fast as I can. I think rules are seatbelts while you drive to the truth. So I love Carol Birch's Sin Boldly, because rules are seatbelts. Right. And that's why they exist, because you need seatbelts for your emotional intelligence of where you're at until you drive it enough that the rule breaks and there's a truth underneath it. So what's the main rule I use? Beginning, middle, and end. It must have a beginning, middle, and end. And there is a journey from an insight, a blind spot of some kind, to an insight of some kind at the end. So that it's not anecdote, which is just a telling of a moment or an event or an experience. It's a placeholder for a story. Story to me, I'm looking. So those are the main rules that I follow. And I try not to pass anything unconscious on
Right.
if I know that it's unconscious. I try not to be lazy. Go, Janice.
I'd like to think I don't have any, but I probably have. I probably have lots. It depends on where I'm going to set it, right? If I'm going to pull it into the present and tell something and retell a traditional story in the present, then I have to try not to be anachronistic in the retelling. But the same thing goes for retelling something and keeping it in the world of the fairy tale or the world of the folktale, is to remember, if you're trying to create a world, if you're building a world for your listeners, which you're doing every time, if you're building a world for your listeners, not to have any anachronisms in that space that will throw the listener out of the story. That's something I think about sometimes. I'm not interested in men beating their wives. I probably won't do that. I find stories where those without power are abused by those who have power. And if I'm looking at those stories, I want to change that dynamic. I want to change the power dynamic there. That's often something that comes into it, is altering the power dynamic. How do you tell this story and not have it carry that same message that it might have carried earlier? I think that everything depends on the story, right? It all depends on the story. What story are you retelling? When I was talking about the Amazon Cinderella that tries too hard, it really tries too hard. There's a big, it's contemporary music in a fairy tale environment that's not adequately integrated. It's contemporary mores put on top of a tale in an effort to have it always. I want to have a love story here, but I want to have a modern love story with this. And it carries too much baggage. The thing to remember about folktales is that they're simple in form and structure, not content, but in form and structure, they are simple. And you don't want to you don't want to put too much freight onto the structure of the tale. Yeah. So you want to try and stay true to the arc of the story. I think the more you know about traditional tales, the more you work with them, the more you incorporate or internalize the rules about form and structure. That's probably where most of my rules are, actually.
Yes.
And then one of our last questions before the overall questions is, do you find it necessary to talk about symbols, and that can include wardrobes if chosen, or other background info, so the audience can connect with your character when telling contemporary folktale retellings? Why or why not? So some examples of maybe some symbols that were brought up, whether or not they're significant in the stories you shared today. There's like pickles or vinegar. I know in the background there, Megan, you have pomegranates, and I know that's really big in the folklore world. So do you want to talk about that first, Megan?
The pomegranates are here because yesterday for Amy Douglas's brilliant Get a Word in Edgeways program, I encourage you all to look that up. I did an Italian Rapunzel, which featured the pomegranate. So I try to just create an environment here in Zoom because we can. And I think that everything that's communicating in this box is also communicating to our listeners. So I do make some choices. I try not to get too precious about it. Pickles, how did that come up? I was at Wild Acres, which is another wonderful thing. You should know. We were working with images, and a girl was holding a pickle jar, and I went, well, she's in a pickle. And the moment I said she's in a pickle, I realized that we get in pickles. And the next thing you know, I'm thinking Red Riding Hood certainly was in a pickle. And then the next thing you know, she's in a pickle cellar, and then the next thing you know, so it was just following the pickle was the trigger. So I just followed the pickles, and the pickles actually rewrote that whole story for me. Changed the grandmother, changed the wolf. It was the following of the pickle. So the pickle was the trigger. I think the stories certainly need a certain rhetoric. If you have a symbol in a story, then carry that symbol through the story. So you don't start with pickles and then you're over here in squash and you're over here in kumquats and you end up with hot dogs. Right. So pickle, 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 let it resonate, let the symbol resonate. So you're not talking about the symbol, you're experiencing the symbol. Okay.
Yeah.
And anything you would like to add on that, Janice?
I'm not giving a lesson when I tell a story. So the idea of explaining the things within the story to my listeners is sort of anathema to me, actually, while I'm working. I'm interested in how people respond emotionally to the tale. I'm not really interested in telling them how they should be responding to it by explaining things within the story. As we said earlier, the story stands by itself or it doesn't. And you want it to have a really firm grounding. But deconstruction after the fact is kind of fun, but in the middle of telling the story, I don't think so.
Yes. Yeah, and if it's something that is not easily understood, your characters have the opportunity to interact with it or say gentle things about it, as long as it's true to the dialogue that they're in, and not expository. So you can find ways to clue your audience in about that cudgel. What's a cudgel? And still stay in the moment of the telling.
Wonderful. And we have our last question to kind of cover anything else. What do you want us to know that we didn't cover about contemporary folktale retellings? This is kind of like your last chance, and feel free in this, not just what to know, is if there's anything in the future we should be aware of or projects, this is your chance to, emphasize yourselves as well. So who would like to go first with this last question?
I guess I'll just leap in and say, tell them, read them, tell them. That's just it. That's the gong that I'm always trying to bang, is to inspire people to tell them and get in relationship with them. The storytelling is a rehearsing in public proposition. It takes a tremendous amount of vulnerability. You're going to fail miserably the first time you tell a story, and you've already won by telling it. So as long as you tell it and 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 tell it, you're rehearsing in public with your audiences. And so be brave, do it. Janice.
I think structure is really important. And I think that you need to pay attention to the arc of the story, which is something Megan mentioned earlier, that it has to have a beginning, a middle, a conclusion. There's a logic to a linear narrative that you need to follow. I think that many stories, whether they're traditional or personal, suffer from lack of structure. And I think the internalization of structure is something that we should really work toward. Mm-hmm. And just do what Carol said, sin boldly. If it doesn't work or it's not working, you'll know. Your listeners will tell you. Right.
So beautiful. Thank you so much. And so big round of applause or hands in the air, or if you're listening on YouTube, this is your chance to use those emojis. I know you know how to use them. So put a ton of applause emojis in there. I did put a link, and it's already pinned on the top. So if you are seeing this streamed, or if you're watching this later, pinned at the top is our link tree. Our link tree is beautiful because it has specific links in connection with the Big Why, but it also has the feedback form. This is very important. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we need feedback. This is what makes it possible to even have grants. So if you don't think your voice matters, it really matters, this is the day it really matters. So make sure you do click on that link. I'll make sure to put it back in that YouTube stream as well. We want to thank Janice Del Negro and Megan Wells for all of their wisdom and their experience and being able to answer a whole ton of questions. We didn't go through all of them, but we got through quite a few of them. I'm pretty proud of what you guys were able to accomplish. What I'm hoping I can convince them to do is maybe they'll answer a couple of those questions and we can even put that on our webpage, storycrossroads.org/thebigwhy. Now that's not going to be right away. It's not even a guarantee that they're going to say yes, but we will put this stream, because it'll be available after the fact, on that webpage. And you can also find our one we did last year. So last year it was on historical storytelling. You can still find that there. So again, a big thanks to Janice and Megan. A big thanks to all of you listening, whether in real time or later. Spread the word with Story Crossroads. We have many events. We have some big announcements. If you go on that link tree, check out some really big announcements that involve our May 9 through 12, 2022 with our summit and festival. And we have to, of course, acknowledge in a visual way. So everyone, thank you so much. I'm going to put that link once more.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Drake and Angie.
Yes, thank you to Drake and Angie for the American Sign Language.
Really, thank you all. Beautiful. The sign language was beautiful. It was beautiful to be able to watch it.
It really
because
was.
sometimes when you're on the stage and you have an interpreter, they're behind you. And so you don't really get to see them. So it was really lovely to be able to watch.